I remember walking along the cracked asphalt path that led to the old school, the kind of place people whisper about but never visit. Fog rolled in thick, curling around the lamppost like pale, restless fingers. The air was cold, yet there was a strange warmth behind the walls, a hum of something alive and waiting. Every step I took seemed muffled, swallowed by silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Or was it whispers? The windows stared back at me, dark and unblinking, reflecting shapes that weren't mine. I reached the front doors, their paint peeling and warped, and a faint smell of dust and memory clung to the air. My hand hesitated over the rusted handle. That's when I saw it. The fog that evening was thick, the wet, gray blanket over the world. IT settled on my coat, damp and cold. I stood in the long hallway of the old school, abandoned for 20 years. The air was still, heavy with the smell of dust and forgotten things. The floorboards were warped, their once bright polish faded to a dull, scratch gray. A low hum vibrated through the soles of my shoes. IT was an electrical sound. IT was deeper at a steady, rhythmic pulse, like the building itself was breathing in and out. The sound seemed to come from the walls, then a faint tremor in the plaster. Then I heard the whispers. They drifted from the rows of lockers, a soft, rustling murmur, and old words I could understand, just a sibilant hiss. But my name was in there. I was sure of it. Woven into the static, a single thread of sound meant only for me. The shadows in the hall began to move. They stretched, long, thin fingers reaching across the floor. They bent at impossible angles, twisting where there was nothing to twist from. There was no light source to cast them, and no window at the end of the hall. Just a deep, gathering gloom and the shifting dark. The few remaining lights in the ceiling flickered a slow, lazy blink. Not a sputtering electrical fault. IT felt like a warning to a slow, deliberate signal. Each time the light died, the hallway grew colder. The hum in the walls grew louder. A coldness brushed against my spine. Not a draft that IT was too deliberate for that of a gentle, icy pressure. Sliding between my shoulder blades, that IT wasn't fear. Why, IT was a deep, unsettling curiosity that needed to understand. I took a slow step forward. The floorboard groaned under my weight. The sound was too loud. IT swallowed the whispers for a moment. The lockers on my right were a faded puke green. Their doors were shut, but I could feel something behind the thin, perforated metal that a presence, waiting. I reached a hand out, and wide fingers hovered an inch from the cold steel. The humming of the walls focused. IT gathered right behind that locker door, a concentrated thrum of energy. The whisper came again, clear this time, and Y named at a soft, breathy sigh from inside the metal. I pulled my hand back. The flickering lights above me sped up, strobing now. Flash. The hallway, empty, flashed at a long shadow, standing where there was none before. Flash. The locker door in front of me was now slightly ajar, a sliver of perfect blackness inside. The cold on my spine intensified. IT spread through my ribs, and a cage of ice forming around my lungs. NY breath hitched at a small, tight sound in the silent hall. The humming had stopped. The whispers were gone. Everything was perfectly, utterly still. All that remained was that dark slit in the locker and the feeling, the certain, dreadful knowledge that something was looking back at me from that darkness. Something that had been waiting, something that knew my name. I took a step back. MY shoes scuffed the dusty floor. The sound was like a gunshot. The locker door creaked. IT opened another inch, wider, inviting, and from that deepening blackness, a single soft footstep echoed my own. The air in the old schoolhouse was thick with the smell of dust and forgotten things. It was a dry, sweet sort of decay. I pushed open a heavy wooden door, its groan echoing down the empty hall behind me, and I found myself standing in a classroom. It was like stepping into a photograph, a perfect, silent snapshot. Outside, the late afternoon sun was warm and golden, but in here, the light was different. It was a pale, lifeless glow, as if the sun itself had grown tired of reaching this place. Rows of wooden desks stood in perfect lines, neat and orderly, waiting for students who had long since grown old. A layer of dust coated everything, soft as powdered bone. On the large blackboard at the front, a lesson was frozen in time. Equations in white chalk, half finished. The dust on the chalk tray was undisturbed for decades. I took a step forward. The floorboard creaked under my weight, a lonely sound. That's when I saw it. At the far right corner of the blackboard, a single line of chalk was moving, slowly, deliberately, scratching its way across the dark slate. It wasn't writing anything, just a faint white line extending itself, curving without meaning. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one there, no hand holding the chalk. It just moved, a ghost in the machine. I stood completely still, watching that line grow, listening to the faint, gritty squeak it made, a sound that should have been impossible. Then, from the teacher's desk, a stack of papers shifted, not like they were falling, but as if a hand had brushed against them. They rustled, a dry, whispering sound. And beneath that rustle, something else, a murmur, a low, collective hum of voices, too faint to make out any words, just the impression of listening, the feeling of a room full of people, all speaking at once, but very, very quietly. I held my breath, trying to hear, trying to find a single word in that soft static, but it was just out of reach. A secret I wasn't meant to understand. The air grew colder. The pale light from the windows seemed to dim, and I felt it then. A pressure, a quiet, focused attention. The room was aware of me. It knew I was here, an intruder in its perfect memory. The chalk stopped moving. The line was complete, a meaningless squiggle. The papers on the desk fell still. The murmuring ceased. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It was a listening silence. I took a slow step back. Then another. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I couldn't look away from the blackboard, from that one new, impossible mark. As I reached the doorway, a final breath of cold air touched my neck. It felt like a sigh, like a dismissal. I turned and walked away, my footsteps too loud in the hollow hall. I didn't look back. I knew, if I did, I would see that pale glow from the classroom doorway, and I would see that the desks were no longer empty. The air in the attic was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. IT was a smell that clung to the back of my throat. The single, bare bulb hung from the rafters. Its light flickered a slow, uneven pulse that made the whole room breathe. Books lay in piles around me. Their spines were cracked and brittle, like the bones of long-dead birds. I knelt on the floorboards, the wood cold and rough against my knees, and my fingers brushed against a leather cover. IT was soft, almost damp. That's when I heard it, a soft thump. IT came from the corner, the deepest corner. Where the light never quite reached, I held my breath. The only sound was the faint hum of the old bulb above me. I told myself it was a house settling. An old house makes old noises. I turned back to the book. Its pages were yellowed. The ink faded. I gently pried it open. The binding groaned in protest. And then a low humming started. IT wasn't from the light bulb. This was different. IT came from everywhere at once. A vibration that started in my teeth and traveled down to my bones. The pages in front of me began to turn. Not from the draft. There was no draft. They turned on their own to a slow, deliberate rustling point one page. Then another. They settled on a drawing I had never seen before. It was a forest sketched in frantic, dark lines. The trees were twisted. Their branches looked like grasping fingers. In the center of the drawing was a figure. IT was tall and thin, impossibly thin. Its head was tilted at a wrong angle. IT was just standing there, watching from paper. I reached out to touch the drawing, to see if the ink was still wet. The humming grew louder. IT filled my ears, a low, droning static. The flickering light strobed across the page. For a second, I thought the figure's head moved, just a twitch. I slammed the book shut. The dust puffed up in a cloud around my face. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was heavy. IT pressing on my eardrums. I was alone again, just me and the books and the dying light. But the feeling didn't leave. The feeling of being watched. IT was a pressure on the back of my neck, a cold spot between my shoulders. I looked around the attic. The tall stacks of books. They were no longer just piles of paper. They felt like barricades, hiding places. Every shadow in the corner seemed deeper now, darker. They held their shape a little too long after the light flickered. I could feel them breathing. The whole attic was breathing with me in out, a slow, patient rhythm. I didn't open another book. I just sat there on the cold floor. listening to the silence, watching the shadows sway, waiting for the pages to start turning again on their own. The key was cold in my hand, that a simple brass key, left me by my great-aunt, along with this old, forgotten house at the end of a rain-soaked street. I turned in the lock. The click was too loud in the evening quiet. The door swung inward on a sigh of stale, dusty air. IT smelled of old wood and forgotten things. The hallway stretched out before me to a long, dark corridor. The only light was a pale, gray glow from a grimy window at the far end. MY footsteps were the only sound, a soft, hesitant crunch on the gritty floorboards. The walls were lined with mirrors, tall, ornate frames, tarnished with age. But every single one of them was broken. A spiderweb of cracks marred their surfaces. MY reflection was shattered in each one, out a dozen fractured versions of me, all stepping forward in the dim light. I stopped in front of the first one. I watched my own eyes in the glass, and I saw it a lag, a delay. I raised my hand. The me in the mirror raised as a moment later to a slow, heavy movement, like he was moving through water or something was holding him back. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step. The reflection took a step a heartbeat too slow. His face was a mass of quiet dread at a feeling I was starting to share. I moved down the hall, my eyes flicking from one broken mirror to the next. In every cracked pane, the same thing, that a sluggish echo of my own movements, the shadow that wouldn't keep up. Then, from the corner of my eye, a flicker. In the third mirror, just over my reflection's shoulder, to the woman's face. Pale, smiling a wide, empty smile. Her eyes were dark hollows. I spun around. The hallway behind me was empty. Just dust motes dancing in the weak light. MY heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I turned back to the mirror. That MY reflection was still there, wide-eyed, but the woman was gone. I kept walking. The air grew colder. The smell changed. The dust gave way to the damp, sweet smell of wet plaster, like a room after flood. Another flicker. This time in a long, narrow mirror to my left, at a man with a kind face, laughing silently. He was there, right behind my lagging reflection. Then he was gone, vanished back into the cracks. My pace quickened. The sound of my footsteps was the only thing I could trust, the crunch of grit, the creak of wood. But the reflections, they were a different story. They moved slower and slower, their movements growing stiff, their faces twisting with a growing panic. I felt deep in my bones. Faces continued to bloom in the glass behind them, a child with wide, curious eyes, an old man with a stern expression, smiles that were too wide, eyes that were too dark. They flashed into existence for a single, terrifying moment. Then they were gone, leaving only my own fractured, delayed self. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, like the reflections were pulling me back, holding me in this terrible, slow-motion nightmare. I stopped, forcing myself to look into one of the larger mirrors. Its surface was a mosaic of broken pieces. MY reflection stared back, his chest heaving. But mine wasn't. I was holding my breath. And then he moved on his own, that he slowly, so slowly, lifted a finger. He pointed past his own shoulder, past the splintered cracks. There, in the deepest shard glass, another face formed. IT wasn't flashed this time. IT stayed. IT was my own face, but younger, the boy of 10 with a scraped knee and a hopeful smile. The me from a long, lost summer. He looked right at me. His smile didn't vanish. IT just faded, dissolving like smoke back into the silver glass. The smell of damp plaster was overwhelming now, thick and cloying the back of my throat. In the silence of the hall, I heard a thumping, rhythmic, insistent. IT took me a moment to realize it was my own heart, beating louder than the emptiness, filling the space with its terrified rhythm. I looked away from the glass. I looked down at my own hands, solid, real. I started walking again, toward the dim light at the end of the hall. I didn't look at the mirrors any more. I couldn't, but I could feel them, the lagging movements, the smiling, silent faces in the cracks, watching me go every step of the way. The key was cold in my hand, heavy, a tarnished brass thing, left to me by my grandfather. I stood in front of the old office building, the one he'd owned for 50 years. The air was damp. IT smelled of old rain and wet brick. The windows were dark, empty. I slid the key into the lock. The tumblers turned with a gritty, reluctant sound. The door was heavier than it looked. IT swung inward with a long, low creak. The smell hit me first, dust, old paper, and something else, something sweet and stale. Like forgotten flowers, I stepped inside. MY footsteps were the only sound, a hollow echo on the wooden floor. The reception area was frozen in time that a calendar on the wall from 1982, a layer of pale dust, covered everything like a soft gray blanket. The light from the street lamp outside bled through the blinds, cutting the darkness into long, thin stripes. His office was in the hall. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it. The hinge protested with a soft metal sigh. His desk was a landscape of forgotten work. Papers were scattered everywhere. Crumpled invoices, faded receipts, and a coffee mug, stained a permanent brown. A green glass lamp stood silent sentinel. Its core a coiled snake on the floor. I saw the nameplate. Tarnished bronze. Arthur Shaw M.Y. Fingers brushed over the engraved letters. They felt rough. Cold, a small piece of him left behind. That's when I saw it, a shift in the air, the darkness that moved on its own, a shadow passed over the high-backed leather chair. IT slid across the cracked material, the smooth, liquid darkness. But the chair was empty. The room was still. I held my breath. The only sound was the frantic beat of my own heart in my ears. Then a voice. Not in the room, the IT was in my head, a soft, papery whisper. IT felt like static in my mind, like a radio tuned to a station just out of reach. Finish the ledger. The words were clear, but the voice wasn't. IT was half familiar, a ghost of a tone I almost recognized, and half foreign, something old and patient. The Henderson account. You left it unbalanced, MY throat. When dried, I remember my grandfather at this desk. Frustrated. Muttering about a client named Henderson. About numbers that wouldn't add up to memory I hadn't touched in 20 years. IT was just sitting there in my mind, and this voice was pulling it out. I looked at the papers on the desk. MY eyes found a faded spreadsheet. The name Henderson was typed at the top of the column of numbers, blurred by time. How? How could it know? The weight in the room changed. IT was no longer just the quiet of an abandoned place. IT was a pressure, the dense, heavy silence that pushed down on my shoulders, pressed on my eardrums. IT was a weight of years of grudges held in the walls, of frustration seeped into the floorboards. This room remembered his anger, his tiredness, and it kept it all, held it close like a secret. He was so close to finishing. The whisper came again, a little sharper, the thread of impatience woven through ITSO clothes. Don't you want to finish it for him? I took a step back. MY shoes scuffed the floor. The sound was too loud in the suffocating quiet. I didn't want to finish it. I didn't want to be here. This wasn't my legacy. IT was his ghost, the ghost of work, that of obligation. The shadow on the chair deepened. IT seemed to lean forward, waiting. The whisper didn't come again. The silence was worse. IT was a listening silence, a hungry one. I turned. I walked out of the office. That MY's steps were quick. Quiet, I didn't look back. I walked down the hall, through reception and out the heavy door. I closed it behind me. The lock clicked shut. I stood on the sidewalk. The night air was cool on my face. That IT was clean. That IT didn't smell of dust and decayed. I could still feel the imprint of the key in my palm, the cold weight of it, and the heavier weight of that room. Pressing down, waiting for me to come back. The air in the old schoolhouse was always thick. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light. I came here to be alone, T.O. think. But the silence here, it wasn't empty. It was a heavy thing. IT pressed against my eardrums, a low hum. Just at the edge of hearing that I walked between the long tables, MY fingers trailing to the grit. The wood was cold. IT smelled of old paper. And something else. Something damp, forgotten. My own footsteps were too loud. They echoed back to me from the dark corners of the hall. But sometimes there was another set to the soft, shuffling tread. Just a half second after mine that I'd stop. And the other steps would stop too, but not quite at the same time that a faint rustle would continue. Like a child in two big shoes, scuffing the floor. I saw them from the corner of my eye. Flickers of movement, a small, pale shape darting behind a row of coat hooks, the fleeting silhouette against a grimy window. Once, I saw one clearly, the little girl, her back to me. Her dress was faded. Her hair was in two long braids. She was perfectly still. Then she was gone. Not like she ran, like a light switched off. The light above me began to flicker, not a single buzzing fluorescent tube. Its pale glow stuttered it on. Off. on, and with each pulse of darkness, the humming grew louder. IT was in the walls, IT was in my head, a droning, tuneless note. IT made my teeth ache. In the flicker, I saw more of them. Frozen in place, a boy kneeling, tying a shoe that wasn't there, point to others, hands clasped mid-swing. Their faces were blurred, smudged charcoal drawings, but I could feel their laughter, the silent, joyous energy that had been trapped here. Pressed between pages of a book no one would ever open again. The humming swelled. The light stuttered faster, the frantic, panicked heartbeat, I in the flashes of light. The children were closer, always closer. The boy with the shoe was now at the next table, over. His head was tilted down, I could see the part in his hair. The girl with the braids was peeking from behind a support pillar. Her face was still turned away, but I knew she was looking at me. The smell of decay grew stronger. Not rot, exactly. More like dry rot, like flowers pressed in a book for 100 years, brittle. Crumbling to dust, IT coated the back of my throat. I tried to speak, T.O. say, hello? But my voice was a dry rasp. The moment I made a sound, the humming stopped. The light above me steadied. The frozen children vanished. The hall was empty again. Just the long tables, the dust, the silence. But it was a different silence. Now, IT was waiting, holding its breath. I took a step toward the door. MY's shoe scuffed the floor. And from the far end of the hall, in the deep shadows, came an answer to a single, soft footstep. Then another, slow, deliberate, that IT wasn't an echo, that IT was a response. I didn't run. Something told me that would be worse. I just walked. MY heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. The footsteps matched my pace, keeping time with me, that a patient, unseen companion. I reached the heavy front door. The cold brass handle felt like ice in my hand. I pulled it open. The evening air was clean and sharp. As I stepped through, I glanced back. The hall was dark, empty. But just before the door closed, I saw in the very center of the room that a single small shadow, standing perfectly still, and I heard it, clear as a bell in the quiet, a child's whisper. IT didn't say a word. IT was just a breath, that a question left hanging in the dead, still air. The key was cold in my hand, heavy, iron, and old. My grandfather left me the house in his will. The lawyer said it had been empty for years. But he mentioned the basement, said it was structurally unsound, that I should never, under any circumstances, go down there. The door was at the back of the kitchen, the perfect dark square in the worn linoleum. IT wasn't locked. IT just opened with a groan that seemed to come from the house's bones. The metal stairs twist downward into darkness. I hear dripping water, but no source. The rail is cold under my hand, vibrating softly as if alive. Shadows slither across the walls, and every step feels like entering a memory not mine. The air at the bottom is thick, that IT smells of wet earth and old wood. And something else, something metallic like old coins. My flashlight beam cuts a weak path through the black. IT dances over stone walls, slick with moisture, over forgotten furniture shrouded in white sheets. They look like sleeping ghosts in the pale light. I take another step. The concrete is damp under my shoes, that a soft, sticky sound follows me. And then I see IT that I am in the far corner, that a shape, huddled and small. It's a child's school desk. The wooden top is scarred with initials at a small, rusted metal frame. I can almost feel the ghost of a small body sitting there, waiting. I move closer. The beam of my light trembles. On the desk, there's a single piece of paper. IT is yellowed and brittle at the edges, and next to it, a pencil, worn down to stub. I lean that MY breath fogs and chill air. The paper is not blank. There are lines on it, 5 of them, drawn in a shaky, determined hand. On each line, a single sentence, written over and over, filling the page. I must not tell them what I see. The writing is small, desperate. Each letter dug deep into the fiber of the page. A cold knot tightens in my stomach. I reach out. The MY fingers brush the paper. It's ice cold and rough. A sudden, sharp crack makes me jump out. I spin around. The flashlight beam swings wildly through the darkness. It was just the house settling, just the old wood groaning. I turn back to the desk. The paper is gone. My heart stutters in my chest. That I look down at the floor. Nothing. I look back at the desk. The pencil is still there, but it has moved. It now lies perfectly straight, aligned with the desk's edge, and it is pointing at me. A soft rustle comes from behind the sheets, like fabric brushing against stone that I hold my breath. The sound stops. I am alone, that I am sure I am alone. But the air feels different now, heavier. IT presses on my ears. I take a step back, that MY's shoulder bumps into something cold and hard. Another sheet draped shape. I don't want to turn around. I don't want to see. From the corner of my eye, I see a flicker of movement. High up on the stone wall, MY light finds it. A shadow, small and hunched. IT doesn't move like a person that's wrong. It slides down the wall, a stain of deeper black in the darkness, and it pours itself into the small chair at the desk. The sheet over the chair doesn't move. IT doesn't rustle. But the shape beneath it is now full, occupied. The pencil on the desk lifts into the AI arc. IT hovers for a moment. Then it begins to move. I hear it. The faint, dry scratch of graphite on paper to sound like bones rubbing together. It is writing. Writing on a page I can no longer see. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I can't move. I can only watch that MY blood is ice in my veins. The scratching stops. The pencil dropped. IT rolls once, then lies still. A breath of air, colder than the rest, touches my cheek. IT carries a whisper, so faint I feel it more than hear it. I must not tell. The sheet on the chair collapses. The shape is gone. I am shaking that I back away. My feet clumsy, then MY light beam jumps across the empty desk. I turn and run for the stairs. The MY hand slaps against the cold, vibrating rail. I don't look back. I can't. I burst through the door at the top, slam it shut behind me. That I lean against it, my heart hammering against my ribs. The kitchen is silent, warm. I am safe. I take a deep, shuddering breath and try to forget the cold, the scratching, the whisper. But as I walk into the living room, my eyes fall on the notepad by the telephone. A single sentence is written there, in a small, desperate hand I have never seen before. I must not tell them what I see. The air in the old house was always cold. A deep, damp cold that clung to your skin. I was looking for a fuse box. A pointless task, really. The power had been dead for decades. But I followed the main hallway back, past portraits with painted eyes that seemed to follow your movement. That's when I saw the double doors. Dark, heavy oak, veined with cracks. One was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The smell was the first thing that hit me. Dust and dry rot. The faint, sweet decay of old wood. The room was vast. A ballroom, maybe, or a hall for parties long forgotten. And they were all there. Pianos, maybe a dozen of them, arranged in a silent, ghostly orchestra. There was scarred and dull. Their keys were yellowed and cracked, like old bones. I took a step inside. My shoes whispered on the grimy floor. Dust motes swam in the pale light from the grimy windows. They swirled and drifted, a slow, lazy dance. And that's when I heard it, from somewhere above. A single, soft note, then another. They drifted down from the high ceiling, from the shadowy balcony that circled the room. A slow, hesitant melody. The notes were wrong, discordant. They didn't form a song I knew, just a strange, sad tune. I stood completely still, listening. The dust in the air changed. It wasn't just drifting anymore. It was pulsing, swirling in time with the broken music, as if it were dancing to it. I felt a pull, a gentle, insistent tug in my chest. My feet moved on their own, carrying me deeper into the forest of silent instruments. The music continued from above, a little louder now. Each note felt like a cold finger tracing the bones of my spine. I stopped beside one of the pianos. Its lid was propped open. I could see the complex machinery inside, all felt in wire and hammers. A intricate skeleton. I reached out. My finger hovered over a yellowed key. And then it stopped. The music didn't fade. It didn't trail off. It just vanished. One moment it was there, filling the vast space. The next it was gone. The silence that rushed in was heavy, solid. It pressed against my eardrums. It pressed against my skin. My chest tightened. I couldn't draw a full breath. The air was too thick, too still. In the absolute quiet, I became aware of everything. The faint smell of my own sweat, the dry taste of dust on my tongue, the frantic thump of my own heart. The dust mote settled. Their dance was over. I looked up at the dark balcony. Nothing moved. There was only the deep, waiting silence. And then a soft click. It came from the piano right next to me. I looked down. Slowly, deliberately, one of the cracked white keys began to depress. It moved on its own, pressing down, down, until it settled into its silent, final position, held there, a note waiting to be played. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I just turned, and I walked. My steps were careful at first, then quicker. I didn't run, but I didn't look back. I felt the silence behind me, a presence in the room, watching from the dark balcony, listening from the still keys. I reached the double doors, slipped through the narrow opening. I didn't close it. I was afraid of the sound the latch would make, the click that would break the silence, a silence that no longer felt empty, but full, and waiting for me to play my part. The air in the school after hours was always so still, a hollow kind of quiet. The only light came from the pale moon through the high windows. It painted the linoleum floors a sickly silver. I was just finishing my rounds, keys jangling on my belt, the only sharp sound in all that soft dark. Then I saw it. The janitor's closet door was already open, just a crack. A deep, cold breath seeped out from the gap. I always lock it. I know I locked it. The smell hit me first. A thick, sweet smell of old lemon-scented cleaner. Underneath it, the metallic tang of rust, like old pipes bleeding into the walls. I pushed the door open. The darkness inside was absolute. Heavy, I fumbled for the switch. The single bulb flickered on. Its weak, yellow light did little to help. The small room was a jungle of shadows, crowded with shelves of bottles and rags. Metal buckets were stacked in a corner. One of them, near the bottom of the pile, was tilted. Its handle creaked as it slowly turned, shifting on its own. My eyes adjusted. I saw the brooms, a dozen of them, lined up against the far wall. Their bristles were all pointing toward me, not falling, not leaning, but aimed, like slender wooden fingers, inviting me deeper into the cramped space. The silence in the room was wrong. It wasn't empty. It was a held breath, a dense hum that pressed against my eardrums, a silence with intent. I took a step inside. The floor felt sticky under my shoes. Each step made a soft, tearing sound. My shoulder brushed against a shelf. A bottle of blue liquid trembled, then went still. I stared into the deepest part of the closet. Behind the water heater, a nest of shadows thicker than the rest. Something shifted there, a slow, deliberate movement. Not a rat. Bigger. The shape was low to the ground. Crouched, I could make out the curve of a back, a suggestion of a limb, folded tight. It didn't move like a person. It rearranged itself, a quiet rustle of something dry, like old leaves scraping across concrete. The hum in the air grew louder. It wasn't in my ears anymore. It was inside my head, a low, static vibration in my teeth. The broom seemed to lean in closer. The tilted bucket finally tipped over. IT didn't clatter. IT landed with a dull, wet thud and began to roll slowly toward the shadow. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The crouched thing in the darkness was perfectly still again, but I knew it was aware. I could feel its attention on me, a pressure against my skin. The smell of rust grew stronger. It coated the back of my throat, metallic and warm. The shadow unfolded. Just an inch. A slow, seamless uncurling. There was no face, no eyes, just a deeper blackness where a head should be. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't hiding. It was waiting. It had been waiting in this small, cluttered room for a long, long time. The broom beside my leg fell. Its wooden handle hit my foot. Not hard. A gentle tap. I took a stumbling step back. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't turn my back. I just moved, one slow step after another. My hand found the doorframe. The cool, painted wood was a relief. I pulled the door shut. The latch clicked into place. A final, solid sound. I stood there in the hallway, listening. The only thing I could hear was the frantic beat of my own heart, and from behind the thin wood, a soft, dry rustling. And then, nothing at all. The air up on the roof was different, cold, and that IT clung to my skin like a fine, damp cloth. The world below was just gone, swallowed by a sea of shifting gray. The fog swirled, slow and heavy to silent, pale ocean beneath my feet. I took a step forward. The gravel crunched under my shoes, a sound that was too loud and all that quiet. The wind moved through the fog, a soft, sighing breath, and within it, something else at a whisper. Not quite a word, just a shape of wonder, warning I couldn't quite understand. I was completely alone, the only person left in the world, standing on an island in the sky. The thought should have been frightening, but it just felt empty. Then I saw it, a shape at the far edge of the roof, a dark cut in the pale mist, a figure, standing perfectly still, facing away from me. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, cold knot. I didn't call out, that MY voice felt too small, too fragile to break the silence. I just stared at the dark outline of a coat, the curve of a shoulder, and then it simply dissolved, not like it walked away, like sugar in water. The fog swirled where it had been, filling the space at AS if it was never there at all. A chill, deep in the cold air, settled in my bones. MY heart was a dull thump in my ears. I walked to the edge, that MY hand resting on the cold, damp railing. I looked down. Below, the lights of the school flickered, small and weak, like drowned stars. They would glow for a moment, a dim orange smudge in the gray. Then they would sputter and vanish, swallowed by the tide. Then they'd flicker back again, a silent, desperate Morse code from a world I could no longer reach. The whispers came again on the wind, a little clearer, now at a rustling, like dry leaves or pages turning. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them, a low, steady hum of dread in my chest. I leaned over the railing, peering into the endless white. The fog was so thick that I felt like I could step onto it, that it would hold my weight, and I could just walk away into all that nothing. A soft crunch of gravel behind me. I froze. MY fingers tightened on the metal rail. IT was ice against my skin. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see the empty space where the figure had been, or worse, see that it was no longer empty. I held my breath, listening. There was only the soft push of the wind, the faint, electric hum from the flickering lights far below. Another sound of a soft, shuffling footstep. Close. Slowly, so slowly. I turned my head. There was nothing there, just the empty roof, the blanket of fog, but the air felt charged, heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. I looked back down at the lights. They flickered once more, then went out for good. The world beneath me vanished into pure, unbroken white. The whispers stopped. The wind died down. In the sudden, absolute silence, I heard my own heartbeat, the frantic, trapped thing in the cage of my ribs. And I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood cold, I was not alone on this roof anymore. The fog began to thin around my feet, just a little, enough to see the shape of something standing beside me. Not a person, just a presence, a deeper cold in the air. I closed my eyes, not brave enough to look. I just stood there on the roof above the fog, waiting for a touch that never came, listening to a silence that was now listening back. The air in the school gym was always cold, even in the middle of summer. It was a deep, damp cold that settled in your bones. I was there late that night, cleaning up after the booster meeting. The only light was a single, pale yellow bulb hanging over the half-court line. It cast long, dancing shadows. Everything else was swallowed by a deep, hungry darkness. I pushed open the heavy door to the locker room. The smell hit me first, the sharp tang of old sweat, and the faint, sweet rot of forgotten fruit from a long-lost lunch bag. It was darker in here. The air was still and thick. I flicked the light switch. Nothing happened, just a dry, hollow click. So I used my phone, the beam cutting a shaky path through the black. The lockers stood in long, silent rows, green and rusted, their doors slightly ajar, like a row of broken teeth. I took a step forward. My shoe stuck to the tile for a moment, then pulled away with a soft, wet sound. That's when I heard it. A low, metallic rattle. It was soft at first. A gentle shaking. I stopped. The sound stopped with me. I held my breath. The silence fell heavy, pressed against my ears. Then, the rattling started again. It wasn't coming from one locker. It was coming from all of them. A slow, rhythmic shaking. In and out, like a deep metallic breath. I swung my phone's light across the locker doors. They trembled, just slightly, the handles shivering. I took another step. A faint mist began to curl around my ankles. It was thin and white, crawling over the floor like living smoke. It had no source. It just was, spilling from the vents under the lockers, coiling around my shoes. And then, from far away, I heard them. Shouts. The sharp, echoing squeak of sneakers on a polished floor. The dull thud of a basketball. It was the sound of a practice game. A full, lively game. But the gym out there was empty and silent. I stood perfectly still, listening to the ghost of a game that wasn't there. I turned back to the lockers. My shadow was thrown against them by my phone. A long, distorted shape. But it was wrong. My arms were at my sides. The shadow on the lockers had its hands up, as if trying to push a door open. I tilted my head. The shadow tilted its head too. But a second later, a delay, I slowly raised my hand. The shadow on the wall remained still for a heartbeat. Then it lifted its arm. I waved. It waved back, but the movement was wrong. Jerkier, like it was learning how to be me. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I lowered my hand. The shadow kept its hand in the air. Then it slowly pointed. A long, dark finger aimed down the row of lockers. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned my head. The mist was thicker now, knee-high, swirling. When I looked back at the wall, the shadow was gone. My own, proper shadow was there, following my movements exactly. The rattling breath of the lockers had stopped. The distant game had gone silent. The only sound was the frantic beat of my own heart. Thumping in my ears, I shone my light down the aisle. The mist swirled where the shadow had pointed. Something was there, the darker patch in the gloom. I took a step towards it. The thing on the floor resolved into a shape. It was a jacket, a varsity jacket, purple and gold. It was just lying there in a heap. I reached down. My fingers brushed against the cold, damp fabric. I lifted it, and as I did, the shadow behind me on the wall. It didn't lift anything. It just stood there, watching me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I could feel it, a presence, standing right where the shadow was cast. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was breathing down my neck. I just stood there, holding the wet jacket. The mist curled around my wrists, cold and gentle. The rattling started again. One single locker, right next to my head. A soft, insistent shake. A whisper. I dropped the jacket. I didn't look back. I just ran. My footsteps echoed in the empty gym. A frantic, panic sound. I didn't stop until I was outside, in the parking lot, under the cold, silent stars. I stood there, gulping the night air, my hands shaking. When I finally looked back at the school, it was just a dark shape against the sky. Quiet and still, but in the window of the locker room, I saw it for just a second. A pale face, watching me. It wasn't shadow. It was just a face. And then it was gone. The air in the gymnasium was cold. And still IT smelled like old sweat and layers of faded paint. The only light came from the high windows of the pale, dusty moonlight. IT caught the floating motes of dust, making them look like they were swimming. I stood just inside the giant doors, MY sneakers silent on the polished wood. The space felt too big, too empty to the cavern where every little breath echoed back at me. Above, the climbing ropes hung down like still brown vines, and the volleyball nets they swayed, just a little soft, rustling shift. But there was no wind in here and no draft I could feel. I took a step forward. The sound of my own movement was too loud, not a scuff against the silence. Then I saw it out of basketball. Orange and scuffed, IT was resting on the far hoop, and it began to roll. It didn't bounce, just rolled at a slow, deliberate turn as if someone had given a gentle, unseen push out. IT came straight for me, a perfect line across the gleaming floor. My breath hitched. I could only watch. The steady, quiet rumble of its spin. IT rolled across the center line. Then the free throw line. IT didn't slow down. IT didn't speed up. It came to a stop, the leather grain facing me. Stopped perfectly, the toe of my shoe almost touching it. The silence it left behind was heavier than before. My eyes lifted from the ball, drawn to the far corner. Behind the rolled-up wrestling mats, a deep pocket of shadow. Something was there, crouched, low to the ground. IT was a shaped a blot of deeper darkness against the cinder block wall. IT didn't move. IT was just waiting. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze and a pressure against my skin. That IT was studying me, taking me in, this thing in the corner. I tried to tell myself it was a pile of jackets, a forgotten duffel bag. But I knew. Piles of cloth don't have that presence. They don't pull the air from a room. I took a step back, and my heart was a dull, quick thump in my chest. The thing in the corner did not move. IT remained perfectly still, not a statue of shadow and intent. A faint smell reached me then, cutting through the sweat and paint. IT was a smell like old paper, like dry, forgotten things, and something else, something metallic, like the taste of penny on your tongue. I could hear a faint hum now, to low, steady vibration. IT wasn't in the room. IT was in my head, to a static buzz that made my teeth ache. The shape in the corner seemed to pulse with IT. T.O. drink the silence and hum back at me. I could feel its patient and endless, terrible patience. IT had all the time in the world, and it was waiting for me to do something. I took another step back, and my leg brushed against the basketball. IT rocked slightly. The sound was like a thunderclap. The thing in the corner shifted. Not its body. IT had no body I could define, but the darkness of it deepened. The air around it grew colder. I felt the chill from across the gym, a winter breath on my face. It was still watching. Its gaze was a physical touch now, a cold spot on my cheek, that I couldn't move, that I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by that silent, focused attention. The humming in my head grew louder, filling my ears with a distant, rushing static. I could see the moonlight glint off the basketball. I could smell that dry, papery smell, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. And then the silence returned. The hum vanished. The pressure of the gaze lifted. Just for a second. I didn't think. I turned, and my feet were clumsy and loud. I didn't look back. I pushed through the heavy gym doors, and I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, under the real moon, gulping in the night air. I looked back at the school, the dark windows of the GYM. IT looked quiet, peaceful. But I knew that I had in that vast, empty space. Something was still crouched in the corner, waiting to end the perfect gymnasium silence. The old high school at the end of my street had been closed for over 20 years, that I passed its chain-link fence every day on my walk. The windows were like black, dead eyes, but that night was different. A soft, pale light was flickering from within, a single, lonely spotlight. IT came from the main auditorium. I don't know why I climbed the fence. The rusted metal bit cold into my palms. The air was still and heavy with the smell of damp plaster and old wood. I pushed open a side door, its groan echoing into a vast, waiting silence. The auditorium was a cavern of shadows. Rows of velvet chairs stretched out before me, all coated in a thick layer of dust. They faced the stage, a dark mouth waiting to speak, and on that stage, the spotlight, IT flickered, weak and sickly, casting more shadows than light. IT illuminated the empty boards of stage floor. Nothing else. I walked down the center aisle, and I saw footsteps were the only sound. They were swallowed by the immense quiet. The dust motes danced in the pale beam like tiny, frantic ghosts. I reached the front row. I let my fingers brush against the cold, dusty velvet of a chair, and that's when I saw it, a shift in the light, a movement on the stage. The air in the center of the spotlight shimmered, like heat rising from summer asphalt. IT wasn't person. There was no shape, no face, no form, but something was there, walking with a slow, deliberate pace from one side of the stage to the other. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the cold air on my skin, that I could taste the dust. I stood perfectly still, watching the empty space move. It reached the far side of the stage and vanished. The spotlight continued to flicker. The stage was empty once more. Then a sound so faint at first, I thought it was the blood rushing my own ears. A soft, muffled rustling IT grew, taking shape. IT was the sound of hands clapping, distant, like it was coming from the other end of a long tunnel or from a long, long time ago. The applause swelled. IT wasn't joyful or loud. IT was polite, hollow. The sound and audience that wasn't really there. IT filled the dusty space, rising to the rafters, a memory of a performance long forgotten. I looked out at the sea of empty chairs. For a single, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw them, sitting in the rows, pale, shapeless figures, facing the stage. Their forms were just suggestions in the deep gloom. A shoulder here, the back of a head there, all watching the empty stage. Then I blinked, and they were gone. Only the dust remained. The muffled applause faded. IT didn't stop. IT just receded, pulling away, back in the walls, back into the past, until the silence returned. IT was deeper now, heavier. The pale spotlight on the stage flickered once more. Then it died completely, plunging the stage into absolute black. I was left alone in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of an audience, witness to a performance, and knowing the air felt cold. And I had a distinct, unsettling feeling that I was the one now being watched. By every empty chair, by every fading memory, that I stood there for a long time in the silent dark, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound. The air in the lab was always cold, a deep chemical cold. It clung to my skin, even through my lab coat. It was late, the kind of late where the overhead lights just hum, a flat, white noise. Everything was clean, polished steel, glass beakers lined up on the shelves, each one holding a silent, clear liquid, reflecting the ghostly light of the moon through the high windows. I was alone, or I was supposed to be alone. There was a smell, sharp, ammonia maybe. It prickled in my nose, at the back of my throat. I was counting reagents. My pen scratched softly on the clipboard. A normal sound, a human sound, then a different sound, a soft, wet crack. I looked up. Nothing had moved. All the beakers were still, perfectly aligned. I went back to my work. My breath a small cloud in the chilled air. Another crack, softer this time, like ice settling in a glass. I turned my head slowly. On the middle shelf, a beaker had a fracture, a thin, hairline crack running down its side. The liquid inside was still, clear, but it seemed to pulse, a slow, faint rhythm, like a sleeping heart. I took a step closer. The linoleum floor was cool under my shoes. I reached out a finger, not to touch it, just to feel the space around it. The air near the glass was warmer, a strange, living warmth. I pulled my hand back. That's when I saw the shadows on the wall. They were wrong. My own shadow was there, cast by the desk lamp, but there were others, long, stretched shapes. They moved, not like people, like arms, reaching, pouring one shapeless thing into another. A silent, dark experiment, mimicking the posters on the wall, but different, twisted. I stood perfectly still. My own breathing was too loud. The shadows kept moving, flowing across the cinder block wall. I could feel it then, a presence, not behind me, not in any one corner. It was hovering just over my shoulder, a curiosity, a watchful, patient thing. It had no eyes, but I felt it looking, studying me, the way I studied the specimens under glass. The smell of ammonia grew stronger. It made my eyes water. The fractured beaker let out a single, clear drip. It hit the shelf with a tiny, sharp ping. The shadows on the wall froze. Then they all slid away, melted into the corners of the room. The presence shifted. It was closer now, right behind me. I could feel the pressure, a gentle, almost imperceptible weight against my back. I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to see what wasn't there. So I just stared ahead, at my own reflection in the dark, high window, a pale face in a white coat, and just over my own shoulder, a faint distortion in the air, a shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt. It lingered there, watching my reflection watch it. Then from the far end of the lab. A single beaker shattered, not from a fall. It just came apart. A soft, wet explosion of glass and clear liquid. The sound echoed in the silent, bright room. And then nothing, just the hum of the lights. The cold on my skin. The sharp smell fading from the air. The presence was gone, but the feeling remained. The feeling of being an experiment, left running overnight, waiting for the scientists to return and check the results. The overhead lights were the first thing I noticed, a harsh fluorescent white. But they weren't steady. They flickered. Not a friendly blink, a sputtering, sickly pulse, like a struggling heartbeat. And with each dimming, a deep hum would fade, then surge back with the light, a rising, falling breath from the walls themselves. I was in a corridor that long, seemingly endless. The walls were a pale, institutional green, the kind that feels cold just to look at. The floor was scuffed linoleum.m. White shoes made no sound on it, just a soft, shuffling whisper of my own movement. The air smelled sterile, like old cleaning supplies and dust. I started walking, and then my hand brushed against the wall. IT felt strangely warm. Almost alive, I pulled my fingers back. The hum in the air seemed to vibrate right through my bones. I passed the first door on my left. IT was heavy metal, with a small wire-reinforced window to I drew even with it. A sound made me freeze. Not a loud sound, a whisper. Faint, like paper rustling. IT was a named MY grandmother's name. Eleanor. She had been gone for 10 years. The voice was hers. Exactly hers. But it came from behind the solid metal. I kept walking at My own breathing was too loud in my ears. The flickering of the lights was starting to ache behind my eyes. Another door. This one on the right that as I approached, the whisper came again, softer this time than a childhood nickname .1 no one had used since I was 7. Leo. It was my father's voice, tired and sad. The way he sounded near the end, I stopped. I wanted to press my ear to the cold metal. I wanted to answer, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I forced myself to move forward. The hum grew louder, deeper. IT wasn't just a sound anymore. IT was a pressure, pushing against my eardrums. The flickering of the lights became more frantic, strobing, turning the corridor into a series of frozen, jerky images. I looked ahead. The corridor seemed longer than before, or maybe it was just a disorienting light. I glanced at the wall beside me. Was it closer? I reached out again. The pale green surface was definitely warmer, almost uncomfortably so. I took another step, and the wall on my left seemed to shift out, a subtle, groaning movement. Not a sound you hear, but one you feel in your teeth. The space between the walls felt narrower. I could stretch my arms out and almost touch both sides. I was sure I couldn't do that a moment ago. Another door. This one had no window, just a blank gray slab as I passed. The whisper was clearer than the others. IT was my own voice, a young, hopeful version of myself. IT said a single word. Tomorrow. A promise I had made to myself long ago, a promise I had broken. The sound of my own hope, trapped here, felt like a physical blow. I started walking faster. The walls were definitely closer now that I had to turn my shoulders slightly to keep from brushing them. The hum was a constant low roar. The lights flickered wildly. On. Off. On. Off did I end the moments of darkness. The whispers from all the doors seemed to swell the chorus of almost recognized voices, the tapestry of my own regrets. I didn't want to hear the next one. I started to run, the clumsy, shuffling jog in cramped space, that MY heart hammered against my ribs. The corridor narrowed further. The ceiling seemed to be lowering. The green walls were now just inches from my elbows. The sterile smell was replaced by something else. The scent of old paper and dry, forgotten things. I dared to look back. The corridor behind me was gone, just a solid wall of darkness, swallowing the path I had just taken. I faced forward again, panting. The flickering stopped. The lights didn't just die. They dimmed down to a single dull orange glow from a bulb far ahead. The oppressive hum faded to a distant, almost imperceptible thrum. The whispers fell silent, complete, total silence, the kind that feels heavier than any noise. The walls had stopped moving. They were just there, close enough to feel their warmth on my skin. I was trapped in this narrow, darkened space that I am the quiet, alone with the ghosts of every name I'd almost forgotten, just waiting for the next whisperer to find me in the dim, orange light. The rain had been falling for 2 days, a steady, gray drizzle against the library's old leaded windows. I was the only one left. Shelving the last of the returns from the night shift, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and wet wool. My cart bumped against the farthest shelf in the history section, the deep oak-paneled wall of forgotten local archives. There was a shuddered, a low, grinding rumble that I felt in my teeth. The entire bookcase shifted backward an inch. Dust sifted down from the top like fine snow. A sliver of darkness appeared behind it, just a narrow, black gap, wide enough to slide through. The air from the gap was cold. IT smelled of wet stone and something else, something older. I squeezed my body into the opening. The space was tight, my shoulders brushing both sides. A steep, narrow staircase led down into the dark. Each step was worn smooth in the middle. From countless footsteps over countless years, MY-owned shoes dislodged tiny clouds of dust. They rose in slow, lazy spirals in the pale light from the library behind me. I took a step down, then another. The darkness below was absolute, a solid thing that I pulled out my phone, turned on a flashlight. The beam was weak, swallowed by the gloom. IT lit up the steps just ahead of me, and nothing more. That's when I heard the soft, scuffling sound in the library above. Like a soft-soled shoe on the polished floor, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I was supposed to be alone. The doors were locked. The night manager had left hours ago. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Maybe it was nothing, just the old building settling, or the rain finding a new path in the gutters. I let out a slow, shaky breath and took another step down. The footsteps started again. This time, they were on the stairs behind me, without a clear, distinct echo. Step, without a pause, step. Matching my own pace exactly, then why heart hammered against my ribs that I didn't want to turn around, and I couldn't bear to see the empty stairs or not empty stairs. I quickened my pace, descending faster. The footsteps behind me quickened too, to a perfect, mocking mirror of my panic. The air grew colder. The smell of damp stone grew stronger. And then a new sensation began to bleed into the silence at a low, deep HU. IT wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. IT was a vibration I felt in my bones, through the soles of my feet, that a resonance coming from the very walls. The building was breathing out a long, slow, ancient breath. I reached the bottom of the stairs. The tunnel opened into a small, circular room that MY phone light flickered, dancing over bare stone walls. There was nothing here, and no furniture, and no artifacts, just empty space, and that relentless, humming breath. The footsteps on the stairs stopped. They had reached the bottom. Too, I could feel a presence there. Just behind my shoulder, the patch of cold air in the already cold room, that I could hear a soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing, but it wasn't mine. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to turn. The hum of the walls seemed to seep into my skull. The faint, dry scent of dust was now a taste on my tongue. The presence behind me just waited, breathing softly in the dark. Finally, I forced my body to turn. The MY phone light trembled in my hand. The beam swept across the empty floor at the base of the stairs. There was nothing there, in 01, just the dark mouth of the tunnel I had come from. But on the bottom stepped a perfect footprint in the thick, undisturbed dust, right where the presence had been standing, watching me. The air in the school was always different at night. Thicker, colder in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. I was a new night custodian. Just me, my car supplies, and the endless, polished hallways. My keyring jangled against my hip, a sharp, metallic sound in the silence. But tonight, the silence felt different as I mopped the main hallway. I noticed a low HU. IT wasn't the fluorescent lights. This was deeper the vibration I felt in my teeth. It was coming from the cafeteria. The double doors were always locked after hours. But tonight, one stood slightly ajar. The sliver of darkness beckoning. The faint, warm, metallic smell drifted out, like old soup and wet iron. I pushed the door open. The hum grew louder. IT pulsed at a soft, rhythmic pressure against my eardrums. The cafeteria was a sea of empty tables and chairs, their shadows long and twisted in the pale emergency light. But the kitchen passed through the far, and it glowed with a faint, shifting light. I walked toward it, my sneakers silent on the tile. The humming was a physical thing now, a thrumming in the air in my bones. I stepped through the swinging door into the kitchen. It was wrong. Steam rose from the center of the room. From nothing. There was no stove on, no pot boiling, just a pillar of shimmering, hot mist that twisted on itself, swirling in patterns that made my head feel strange. A soft clinking sound to my left. The wall was lined with giant pots and pans, hanging from hooks. They were old, caked in a dull orange rust. They swayed ever so slightly, tapping against each other with a sound like dull wind chimes. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. And then I saw them. Figures, standing behind the stainless steel counters. They were pale, so pale, they seemed to glow in a strange steam-light. Their shapes were indistinct, like people seen through frosted glass. They stood perfectly still, arms at their sides. I blinked, my heart hammering against my ribs. They were gone. I took a shaky breath, telling myself it was just the steam, the shadows playing tricks on my tired eyes. I looked back at the rusting pots. They were still now. The clinking had stopped, but the humming was still there, that steady, pulsing beat, thump-thump, thump-thump. I forced myself to look across the kitchen again. Another one closer this time. Right by the industrial sink a pale, tall figure. Its back was to me. IT didn't move. IT just stood there, a silent sentinel in the haze. I didn't dare blink. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on it. And then, without a sound, it simply wasn't there anymore. IT dissolved into the steam. My hands were trembling. I gripped the edge of a cold counter to steady myself. The metal felt unnaturally cold. I saw a third one near the walk-in freezer. This one was facing me, but it had no face, just a smooth, blank expanse of pale skin. I stared into that emptiness, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. I squeezed my eyes shut, just for a second out of desperate, foolish hope that it would reset the world, make it normal again. When I opened them, the figure was gone, but the steam swirled a little faster. The humming felt a little louder, thump-thump. I couldn't be here. This wasn't my job. This wasn't in the cleaning manual. I turned to leave. My legs felt heavy, like I was moving through deep water. And I saw last one. IT was standing directly in front of the swinging door at MY only way out. It was closer than any of the others, so close I could see the texture of its pale, waxy skin. IT had no eyes and no mouth, but I knew it was looking at me. We stood there, frozen in that humming, steamy kitchen. The rusted pots began to clink again, softly to a frantic, nervous rhythm. I don't know how long we stood like that. Me, a living, breathing man, and it, a thing of silence and stillness. Then, without a sound, it tilted its head, just a slight, curious angle, and then it faded. IT didn't walk away. It just dissolved into the air, like milk mixing into coffee. The door was clear. I stumbled out of the kitchen. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in the main hallway, leaning against the cool, familiar lockers, gasping for air. The hum was gone. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. I never went back in the cafeteria kitchen. After hours, I'd mopped the floor outside, my eyes fixed on that closed door. Sometimes, I'd see a flicker of movement through the small wire-reinforced window, a shift in the shadows. And sometimes, I'd hear it. Faint but unmistakable, the soft, rhythmic clinking of rusted metal, tapping out a patient, waiting rhythm. The air in the art room was always thick with the smell of turpentine and old wood, and a silence that felt full. I came in after hours. The long, high windows in the pale orange of setting SUN. IT cut across the floorboards in dusty stripes. MY footsteps were the only sound, or they should have been. The paintings watched me. Portraits from a century ago, lined up along the dark walls. Their faces were stiff, formal. But as I walked to my ease in the center of the room, I felt their eyes at a slow, heavy pressure against my skin. I tried to focus on my own canvas, a simple landscape, a field at dusk. But my brushes weren't where I'd left them. They were in a jar of murky water, swaying. Not from any draft I could feel a slow, gentle dance back and forth, like seaweed in a deep, quiet ocean. I reached for one, MY fingers trembled just above its handle. Before I could touch it, it lifted onto W. IT rose from the water, dripping, drifted to the air in my palette. IT dipped itself into a smear of crimson, the color I knew I hadn't squeezed out. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back. The floorboard creaked, a sharp sound in the heavy quiet. And that's when I heard it. Not a sound, really, more like a murmur. It was a feeling of a word being formed. Without the word itself, the vibration, the IT started in the back of my teeth, a low hum that wasn't a noise, but a thought that wasn't mine. Stay. I looked at the portraits. The stern man in the frock coat. His eyes seemed softer now, tired, and the woman in the lace collar. I could have sworn her head was tilted just a degree more than before, a faint, sad understanding in her painted gaze. Another brush lifted from the jar. This one swirled itself in a pool of deep, bruised purple. IT floated to my canvas and began to stroke. Not on my field eye in the empty, dark corner of the painting. It started to form a shape, the curve of a shoulder, the line of a neck. The murmuring grew. Not louder, deeper. IT settled in my bones, a chorus of whispers made of feeling. Not sound. I felt a longing so sharp it ached, a loneliness that had been waiting in this room for 100 years. Show us. The brush moved with the life of its OW, and IT painted a face in the corner of my landscape. Eyes that were too knowing, a mouth that seemed about to speak. IT was a woman from a wall, but not as she was painting a S. She remembered herself. I couldn't move, though I was rooted to the spot, held by this silent, desperate conversation. All around me, the other brushes began to rise, a silent, floating orchestra. They dipped into colors that bloomed on my palette like bruises. Colors with no name. They flew to walls, to the spaces between the frames. They began to paint on the bare plaster. Not new pictures, but memories, fragments of lives left behind. A child's hand holding a wilted flower, at a view from a window I'd never seen, at a tear on a cheek. The room was alive with their silent stories at a museum of whispers, and I was their only guest. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The brushes fell. They clattered into the jar, sending dark water splashing onto the floor. The murmuring faded from my bones, leaving a hollow chill behind. The room was silent again, truly silent. The portraits were back to their stiff, formal selves, but my canvas was different. The field at dusk was gone, replaced by a crowd of faces, all looking out at me. Their eyes were gentle, grateful, and in the very center of them all, the brush I'd first reached for was now painted. Lying at their feet, that a final, quiet signature. I stood there for a long time, in the deep and waiting silence, until the last of the orange light faded from the windows, and the room was left in the dark, alive and not alone. The air in the boiler room was thick and warm. IT smelled of damp concrete and old metal. The low hum vibrated up to the soles of my shoes. I was down there to check the pressure gauges, a simple 5-minute task. But the moment the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the silence changed. It wasn't a true silence. IT was filled with the hiss of steam escaping a pipe, the groan of the water heater, the faint, rhythmic thump of the building's heart. I walked past a main furnace. Its great iron body was warm to the touch dot of comfort, in a way. Then I felt it a sudden, sharp cold at a pocket of winter in the middle of all the heat. IT brushed against the back of my neck. I stopped, listened. The steam kept hissing. The floor kept vibrating. But the air around me, it was still, and it was getting colder. My breath plumed out in a soft, white cloud. IT hung in the air for a moment before fading. I could see the metal shelves along the wall. Now the fine, glittering frost was creeping across them. It was beautiful and wrong. I took a step forward. Y shoe crunched on something. I looked down. The concrete floor was dusted with a thin skin of ice. From the corner of my eye, I saw the shadows shift, not from a single bare bulb overhead. They moved on their own, stretching, lengthening, dancing along the cinder block walls. One shadow detached itself from the rest. IT slid, smooth and silent, across the pipes. IT didn't have a shape I could name, just a patch of deeper dark that a moving stain. It was following me. I turned slowly, then my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The frost was spreading, reaching for the furnace itself. Tendrils of white ice climbing the warm iron. And then I heard it, a laugh. It was faint, distant, like it came from the other end of a long tunnel. But it was also intimate, a whisper meant only for me. IT was a child's laugh, light and airy, but there was no joy in IT. That IT was a cold, empty sound. The laugh echoed softly between the thumps of the machinery. IT seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the steam, from the shadows, from the cold itself. I backed away, MY's shoulder brushed against a cold copper pipe that I flinched. The laugh came again, closer this time, right behind my ear. I spun around. Nothing, just the endless maze of pipes and valves, and the cold IT was deepening, settling into my bones. A shadow pooled at my feet. IT didn't belong to anything. IT just was a circle of perfect blackness on the frosty floor. I looked up at the main pressure gauge. Its glass face was fogged, but I could see the needle that IT was dropping. The steam was losing its fight against the cold. The whisper laugh drifted through the room once more. IT wasn't playful. IT was a taunt, a reminder that I was not welcome here. I was completely alone, surrounded by the machinery that was supposed to heat the entire building, and I was shivering and my fingers were going numb. The single light bulb above me flickered. Once, twice, in that moment of near darkness, I saw them, small, pale shapes moving between the boilers, just glimpses of a small hand, the flash of a smile with too many teeth. The light steadied. The shapes were gone, but the cold remained. IT was a physical weight now, pressing down on my chest, making each breath a struggle. I knew I had to leave. I had to get back to the door, back to the stairs, back to the world above. I took a step. The frost on the floor cracked like broken glass. Another step. The shadow at my feet flowed, liquid and dark, staying with me. I didn't run. I walked 1 foot in front of the other, through the hissing steam, through the unnatural cold, through the soft, whispering laughter that followed me all the way to the door. My hand, trembling and stiff with cold, found the metal handle. IT was so cold it burned my skin that I turned it, pushed. The heavy door swung open with a groan of relief. Warm, stale basement air washed over me. IT felt like a summer breeze. I stumbled out that I didn't look back. I just closed the door. I leaned against it, listening, from the other side of the thick metal. Nothing, noise, NOHUM.NO laugh. Just a perfect, waiting silence. And the deep, deep cold. The key was cold in my hand. Heavy, iron. I'd found it in the bottom drawer of the old desk. The one that used to be the principal's. The basement door was never meant to be open again. That's what they told me when I took the job to a new school, a fresh start. But some doors, they called to you. The lock groaned a deep metal protest. The door swung inward, into the dark. The stairs went down, wooden, old. Each one cried out as my weight settled on it, a sharp creak, then a low moan like the house itself was in pain. The air changed with every step. Upstairs it was dust and lemon cleaner. Down here it was damp, heavy. There was a taste to it, metallic, like sucking on an old penny dot or the smell of blood from a split lip. I reached the bottom of MY breath, clouded in the beam of my flashlight. The concrete floor was gritty under my shoes. The light swept across the room. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling, thick as curtains. And there were the files, dozens of them, hundreds scattered across a long, low table, spilling out of cardboard boxes, manila folders, yellow with age. Some were tied with string. Others were burst open, their contents spilling out like secrets. I picked one up. The paper felt brittle. D-R-Y. IT smelled of mildew and forgotten things that I shone the light on the name typed at the top. Jonathan Miles, a student from 40 years ago. And then I heard it. Not a sound you hear with your ears, a whisper inside my head, and a feeling that curled up from the paper into my fingers. He was afraid of the dark. He cried for his mother every night. I dropped the folder. IT slapped against the floor. The sound echoed in the stillness. I picked up another. Sarah Jenkins. She hid her father's whiskey bottles. She thought it was her fault. The words weren't on the paper. The paper was just grades, attendance records. But the whispers were there. The true stories, the hidden shames, the private fears of every child who ever walked these halls. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. I shouldn't be here. I wasn't meant to know these things. I took a step back, and light swept across the far corner of the room. And for a moment, I saw it that a deeper shadowed a shape. It was gone when the light settled. just an old boiler, a stack of chairs. But the feeling remained. The feeling of being watched, not from one place, from everywhere. From the shadows between the boxes, from the space behind the furnace, from the dark, wet bricks of the foundation. Eyes, dozens of them, unblinking, tracking my every move, judging me for my intrusion. I could feel their gaze, the pressure against my skin, a cold spot on the back of my neck. I looked down at another file, fallen open at my feet. This one had a photograph of a class picture, rows of children in crisp uniforms. But their faces were blurred, smudged, and in the center of the front row, one face was clear to a boy with wide, frightened eyes. He was looking right at the camera, right at me, his name whispered in my mind. Thomas, he never spoke a word. Not after what happened in the gym. My throat tightened. I couldn't breathe. The metallic IT was suffocating me, filling my lungs with a taste of old secrets and silent regret. I had to get out to... I turned to M. While a flashlight beam danced wildly over the stairs, I took a step. Then another. The eyes followed me. I could feel them on my back. A weight, a cold presence. I didn't run. Running would make it real. I just walked 1 foot in front of the other, up the groaning stairs. I stepped back into the hallway. The clean, bright light was blinding. I shut the basement door. The lock clicked back into place without a final, solid sound. I stood there for a long time, just breathing. The taste of metal was still on my tongue. The feeling of those silent, watching eyes was still on my skin. And in my head, the whispers had not stopped. The air in the old school was always cold. A deep, damp cold that clung to the skin. I was there to fix a leaking pipe in the basement. That's what they'd told me. But the basement stairs led down and down, much further than any blueprint showed. And at the bottom I found it, a long corridor, stretching into a darkness my flashlight couldn't pierce. On either side, a row of lockers, rusted and ancient. Their green paint was peeling, flaking off like dead skin. The air was thick. It smelled of old paper, forgotten books left in the rain. And underneath that, the sharp, metallic tang of blood rust. I started walking. The only sound was my own breath, and the soft crunch of grit beneath my boots. The lockers went on. There was no end to them in the gloom. I counted maybe 50, then 100. My light began to feel small, a tiny, trembling thing in all that silence. Then a soft click. To my left, a locker door swung open, slowly. Its hinges whined a low, tired note. I shone my light inside. Nothing. Just empty, dark space. And a few dust motes dancing in the beam. I kept walking. Another click, this time on my right. Another door easing open. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Again, nothing. Just that deep, empty black. A third door opened. Then a fourth. A soft, synchronized chorus of groaning metal, all revealing the same perfect void. My heart was a frantic thing in my chest. I started walking faster. The doors continued to open, one after another, a wave of them, preceding me down the hall, each one a promise, each one a lie. That's when I saw it, from the corner of my eye. In the locker I just passed, a flicker. I stopped, turned my head slowly. My light hit the open locker door. For a fraction of a second, there was a shadow inside, dense and black. It had a shape, almost human, but wrong. The limbs were too long. The head tilted at an impossible angle. Then it was gone, vanished, like it was never there. I took a step back. My breath hitched. Another movement. In the locker across from it. Another shadow. It darted through the beam of my light. A fleeting stain on my vision. It was inside the locker. Then it wasn't. The smell changed. The old paper smell soured. It was the smell of something rotting, something sweet and spoiled. And the rust smell grew stronger, like warm, wet metal. I started to run. My boots slammed against the concrete, echoing down the endless hall. The locker doors were all opening now, swinging wide in a wave of screeching metal. And in each one, for just a moment, a shadow would appear, a flicker of something living in the dark. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. I ran until my lungs burned, until the taste of copper filled my mouth. There was no end, just more lockers, more doors, more shadows. I finally collapsed, my back against the cold, damp wall. I slid to the floor. The doors in front of me were all open. The shadows within them were still, silent. I switched off my flashlight. The darkness was absolute, a solid thing. In the silence, I could hear it, a soft, dry rustling, like pages turning in a book. It was coming from inside the lockers, from the things standing inside them. I put my head in my hands. I closed my eyes, but it didn't matter. I could still feel them, watching, waiting in the hall of lost lockers. For what? I'll never know. The air was thick that night that a cold, wet blanket of fog had settled over the neighborhood after sunset. IT swallowed the streetlights, turning them into hazy, golden orbs. I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at nothing. And then I saw it. The park across the street. The one I looked at every single day. Something was wrong. The swings were moving. They swayed back and forth, a slow, gentle arc cutting through the mist. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly, utterly still. The leaves on the old oak tree weren't even rustling. Yet the swings kept going, that empty, rhythmic creak of the chains at a sound I felt more than I heard. I pulled my sweater tighter. The fabric was cold from the damp, but I unlocked the back door and stepped on the patio. The fog tasted like wet metal and old rain. IT clung to my skin, that NY breath plumed out in a small white cloud, and then another sound reached me, faint like a memory. Laughter. It was a child's laugh. I was sure of it. But it was wrong. Stretched thin, pulled apart like taffy until it was just a series of broken notes. IT echoed from deep within the playground, a place that should have been silent and empty at 2 a.m. I took a step forward. The grass was slick under my slippers. Each step was too loud. The fog seemed to drink the sound, making everything feel heavy. I reached the edge of the blacktop that surrounded the play area. The jungle gym was a dark skeleton in the mist, the slide a silver tongue disappearing into the gloom. That was when I saw the shadows. They were low to the ground, quick little flickers of movement between the monkey bars and the slide. Just at the corner of my eye, I'd turn my head, and there would be nothing, just a steady, silent sway of the swings. The distorted laugh would come again, from a different direction now. Behind me that I spun around, my heart a frantic drum in my chest. Nothing, only the wall of gray. I took another step on the rubberized IT. IT felt soft, giving way under my weight. The air grew colder that I could see the individual droplets of moisture hanging in the space around me as shadow darted. This time, it was closer. Right by the base of the slide, IT was small, the size of a child. But it moved wrong, a skittering, jerky motion. IT was there, and then it was simply gone, and no footsteps, and no rustle of clothing. Just silence. The laughter came again. This time, it was right beside my ear, the soft, wet giggle that was more static than joy that I froze, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. I couldn't move my feet. I could only stand there, in the center of that empty playground, a prisoner in the fog. The swings began to slow. Their creaking faded into a soft, metallic sigh. The laughter didn't return. The deep, humming silence fell over everything. IT was a silence that pressed against my eardrums at a void where sound should have been. I finally forced myself to look down. There, in the damp rubber mat next to my foot, was a perfect, small handprint. IT was fresh. Beads of moisture collected along the edges of the tiny fingers. IT hadn't been there a moment before. I looked back toward my house. The golden light from my kitchen window was just a smudge in the distance of a faint, impossible warmth. The fog between here and there seemed to thicken. IT swirled slowly. Alive, I took a slow, shaky breath, and I started the long walk back across the grass, feeling a dozen unseen eyes watching my every step, hearing nothing but the frantic beat of my own heart and the crushing, absolute silence they left behind. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving only the fog, a thick, gray blanket that swallowed the backyard whole. I stood in the upstairs hallway. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. The house was so quiet I could hear the softening of the refrigerator 2 floors down. My breath hitched. I realized I was staring at the window at the end of the hall, the one that looked out over the old oak tree. Its glass was cracked in one corner, the tiny spiderweb fracture I'd been meaning to fix for years. Tonight, it seemed larger, I took a step closer. The MY reflection in the dark glass was a ghost of a pale smudge against the deeper blackness outside. Another step. The floorboard groaned under my weight. The sound was too loud in the sleeping house. I reached the window, pressed my hands against the cold glass. The fog was so dense, IT bled into itself, swirling in slow, silent currents. Then I saw it a shift in the gray, not a shape that was too tall, too straight to be a tree. It moved. Just a subtle drift to the left. My heart stuttered in my chest. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the chill pain that I tried to blink the shape away. T.O. convinced myself it was just the fog, just my tired eyes. But it stayed. And then another one shifted beside it, a shorter, wider form. They were just standing there in the middle of my yard. My throat felt tight, that I couldn't look away. That's when I saw the light, or the lack of it, a patch of fog that seemed thinner, a faint, sickly glow, like moonlight filtered through milk. In that glow, something glinted .2 somethings, small and silver bright. Eyes! There were eyes, reflecting that pale, impossible light. They weren't blinking, just watching. A cold dread trickled down my spine. I should run, that I should wake my wife. But my feet were rooted to the spot. MY fingers, still pressing glass, had gone numb. A low hum began to seep into the room, so quiet at first. I thought it was in my own head, a ringing in my ears from the silence, but it grew out a soft, droning vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around me. It wasn't a mechanical sound. IT was organic, alive at a gentle, coaxing tone that wrapped around my thoughts. It seemed to pull at me, a gentle pressure behind my eyes, a quiet suggestion in my blood. Come closer. The thought wasn't my OW, and IT was a whisper that rode on the back of that hum. The shapes in the fog began to drift forward, slowly, deliberately. Their movements were all wrong. They didn't walk. They simply flowed, gliding over the wet grass without a sound. The humming grew a little louder. IT filled my ears. IT muffled the sound of my own breathing, the frantic beat of my heart. One of the figures stopped directly below my window, that I couldn't see its face, only the dark outline of its head, and those two pinpricks of light, staring up at me. The hum changed pitch. IT became a soft, questioning note at a single, sustained syllable I couldn't quite understand. My hand trembled. I wanted to step back. T.O. pulled the curtains shut and hide under the covers. But I didn't. I leaned closer. The cold from the glass seeped into my forehead. The figure below raised an AR. IT was too long, too thin. IT lifted a hand, pale and indistinct in the fog, and pointed, not at me, at the window latch. My eyes drifted to the small brass lock. That IT was old, tarnished. The humming became a gentle, encouraging purr. My own hand moved slowly, as if through deep water. MY fingers brushed against the cold metal of the latch. A jolt went through me, a spike of pure fear. I snatched my hand back, stumbling away from the window. MY's shoulders hit the opposite wall. I stood there, panting. The hum was gone. The silence it left behind was heavy, absolute. I forced myself to look back at the window. The fog was just fog. The yard was empty. The pale light had vanished. There was only the dark glass, the cracked pane, and my own terrified reflection, staring back. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, waiting for the hum to return. It never did. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard, and I know, with a certainty that chills me more than the fog ever could, that they know I'm here. The air in the basement was always cold, a damp, earthy cold that clung to your skin. I was down there looking for an old cardboard box. Christmas decorations, I thought, something to make the empty house feel less still. That's when I saw IT in the far wall, behind a sagging shelf the door. It was narrow, made of heavy, dark wood, streaked with rust and age, and I'd lived here for 3 years. I'd never seen it before. A thick iron padlock hung from a hasp. IT was crusted with reddish-brown scab. The wood around the lock was splintered, as if someone had once tried to get in or to keep something in. I took a step closer. The concrete floor was gritty under my slippers. There was a hum, a low, steady vibration that came up through my feet That IT was a deep electrical sound, but old, the kind of hum you feel in your teeth. I reached out and my fingers brushed the cold, rough wood. The hum seemed to pulse at a slow, steady heartbeat under the house. I wrapped my hand around a tarnished brass handle. IT was freezing. I turned IT. IT didn't budge. I put my weight into it. The mechanism groaned a sharp, metallic protest. IT resisted me. IT felt intentional. Then a draft. IT came from the thin space under the door, the breath of air, colder than the rest. IT carried a smell. Dust, yes. But underneath that, the sweet, thick scent of turned earth out of wet clay. And on that cold breath, a voice that no voices. Faint, like a radio station playing in another room. Too distorted to make out words. Just a murmur, a soft, overlapping whisper of many people. I held my own breath, trying to listen. The sound was just on the other side of the door, not a social gathering happening in a tomb. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. What I'd been doing down here, just a normal evening. Now this door existed. This filled my head. I leaned and my ear almost touching the cold wood. The whisper sharpened for a second, the woman's voice clear and close. It's not so bad in here. I jerked back, stumbling over my own feet. The hum deepened. The padlock seemed to stare back at me, the dark, unblinking eye. I should call someone, not a landlord, a locksmith. But a deeper part of me knew they wouldn't be able to open it. This wasn't that kind of door. Another draft, stronger this time. IT swirled around my ankles. The scent of wet soil was overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could hear a child's laugh. Then a man, speaking calmly. You'll see soon enough. Regret washed over me that a cold, heavy wave. Why had I touched the handle? Why had I listened? Some doors are locked for a reason. Some silences are meant to be kept. The hum settled into a steady, waiting rhythm. The whisper softened, receding back into a gentle murmur. The draft died away, leaving only the basement's natural chill. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the door, the padlock, the splintered wood. I finally turned away and my legs felt weak. I climbed the stairs, each step a little heavier than the last. I closed the basement door at the top. I turned the latch out a soft, final click. But back in the kitchen, standing in the yellow light, I could still feel it. The low, persistent hum in the soles of my feet, that a constant reminder of the locked door below, and the voices waiting in the dark. The air in the hallway was cold, the deep, damp cold that settled into my bones. Fog curled around my legs. IT spilled from every doorway, from the living room with its silent television, from the kitchen with its empty chairs. IT was a river of pale, shifting mist. And then the whispers began, not from one place, but from all of them at once. The soft, rustling breath from the bedroom, a low, humming murmur from the basement stairs, a child's faint sigh from the attic. They wove together the quiet, crawling choir of my own past. Every room I had ever walked through in this house, every shadow I had ever glanced at, they were all speaking now. Their voices were not loud. They were a texture to feeling against my skin, like cobwebs in a dark corner. I could feel them more than I could hear them. I tried to understand the words, but they weren't really words at all. They were memories. The scent of old books from the library, the chill of the cellar floor on my bare feet, the static of the radio from the shed. All of it was here, swirling in the fog, a symphony of everything I had tried to leave behind. I took a step forward. The floorboards made no sound. The fog swallowed my footsteps. IT was like moving through deep water. The whispers pressed closer. They weren't threatening. They were waiting. That's when I saw IT the far end of the hall, where the darkness was deepest, a shape, tall and still, just standing there, watching. My breath caught in my chest, a sharp, cold needle that I couldn't tell if it was a man or just a shadow given form. IT had no face and no details, just a stillness that felt older than the house, older than me. The whispers faded, not all at once, but one by one. The sigh from the attic trailed off, the hum from the basement softened into nothing. The rustling from the bedroom ceased, until the only thing left was a silence. It was a heavy silence, a thick wool blanket smothering the world. I could feel the weight of it in my ears, against my eardrums, I in the hollow of my throat. IT was louder than the whispers had ever been. And in that quiet, I understood. The figure at the end of the hall wasn't a guest. IT wasn't an intruder. IT was a house. Its final, quiet thought. Its patient, waiting soul. IT had been here all along. Listening, collecting every whisper I had ever made. I looked down at my own hands. They seemed pale in the dim light, almost translucent. Like the fog itself, I tried to remember the front door, the feel of the knob, the way of the wood. But the memory was fuzzy, distant, like a dream from a long, long time ago. The figure had not moved. IT didn't need to. IT was waiting for me to understand. This hallway wasn't a path to an exit. IT was the final room, the last page, and I had been reading its story my whole life. I took another step, not toward the shape, but just forward, into the silence, into the fog. The cold didn't feel so harsh anymore. IT just felt like being. I may never leave this place. The thought came, not with panic, not with fear, but with a slow, quiet acceptance, like a final, soft whisperer settling into a deep and endless sleep.